Is this America, the land of the free and the home of the brave, where we have to sleep with our telephones off the hooks because our lives are threatened daily because we want to live as decent human beings in America? Those words were spoken in 1964 by Fannie Lou Hamer. She was standing before the Credentials Committee at the Democratic National Convention in Atlantic City, representing the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party. She was there for a simple, radical reason: to challenge the all-white, anti-civil rights delegation that claimed to represent her state. By the time she reached that microphone, Hamer had survived state-sanctioned beatings, constant death threats, and systematic humiliation. When she asked that question, "Is this America?" she wasn't looking for an answer. She was cutting straight through the national myths. And that may be the perfect doorway into our episode today, because the story we're telling isn't just about a single movement or a moment in time. It is about the friction that occurs when Americans begin demanding that this country finally live up to its own language. Not eventually, not in theory, right now.
And that's the theme. Last week, we really dived into Vietnam and 1968 as this pivotal year and the breaking point of the long 1960s. And today, we're going to widen the lens and rewind just a little bit because, before the decade cracked open, there was a surge of this kind of energy of democracy and reform that really transformed American life. Civil rights activism is going to force the political system to sort of acknowledge these changes, and then as other groups start to step through that opening, they start introducing demands of their own.
Can I be honest with you guys?
No.
Yeah.
Not if you're going to be hurtful.
I'm not. I just found out what the topic of this episode is in the last 1 minute and 56 seconds.
You know what? I bet you probably had an idea since you knew what we talked about
No,
last
I
week.
honestly, I didn't know if we'd be going
Because chronology
into matters, but I didn't know if we'd be going into more of Vietnam or into the 1970s or...
Good thing this
Yeah.
ship has a captain that's navigating
So
us
true.
through the
but
darkness.
Nonetheless, I am prepared to talk about this topic today. We're going to continue discussing the civil rights, and the goal here is to really tell two stories. One is about genuine expansion, looking at voting rights and civil rights legislation and new movements and new identities and new claims on freedom. But the other is about conflict over what freedom even means. Does it mean access? Does it mean dignity? Does it mean representation in politics? Does it mean control over your own body, control over your own community, protection from police? Does it mean equal pay, a place in curriculum, or a vote that actually counts?
It's a lot of questions.
I have a lot of questions because I didn't know what the
questions.
topic was, so I've got questions.
We need to answer these questions because,
She's got questions.
really hanging over all of this is the Great Society, the vision of Lyndon Baines Johnson and his presidency, trying to build on the New Deal and the promises of the New Deal and expand those. And as the Great Society is unwrapped, it introduces an era when the federal government is trying to imagine, okay, what does the richest democracy in the world look like? What does it owe to its citizens? And Johnson is going to ultimately argue that the Great Society is not just about more stuff and consumerism or commercialization. It's about overall quality of life, community, education, and human possibility. And so if you think about how the Great Society is going to give these different groups, these reformers, the opening that they need, it's going to raise expectations, and ultimately the nation cannot meet these expectations easily or evenly. All right, so let's start with civil rights in the early 1960s. We've already had an episode about the long origin story of civil rights and how we roughly get to the early 1960s and all of the key critical events. But now we need to kind of understand what's happening big picture with American politics, because it kind of starts with Kennedy, JFK early in his presidency, sort of having this sympathetic view towards civil rights, but still he's a Democrat who has to hold together the New Deal coalition. He's got to hold on to the Southern Democrats that helped him win the presidency. So he's got to be cautious, and he doesn't really come in as this full-throated crusader because, like presidents before him, he's worrying about alienating those supporters that he's had. So activists on the ground, like is always the case, are moving much faster than politics above.
And that is such an important point, and I normally don't say that to you.
Wow.
Such an important point because this really is a grassroots movement. That means
did your students kind of, when we talked about this, they're like, what's grassroots?
right. So let's explain
Mine
it.
didn't. It had already been fully explained months back.
Perfect. Man, I missed
They're
that
getting a good education in Mr. Hill's class.
Wha-bam!
Sorry, I turned your volume
turn- yeah,
up.
you
Okay,
did.
so grassroots. I want everybody to picture, close your eyes, everybody who's listening,
Okay.
and imagine grass. Imagine all the individual blades of grass
Kentucky
that make
bluegrass
up the
or
lawn.
zoysia?
Quiet.
Okay.
Imagine all the blades of grass that make up a lawn, right? You can't have that lawn without all of those individual blades doing their part and doing the hard work of growing. That's grassroots. Think of all of these activists at the local level. They are a blade of grass, and they are the ones doing all of this work. The change is not beginning in Washington. It's really arriving there under pressure. And that's that is a continuity in American history that change, the government is often very reactionary to what people are upset about and what people are organizing about. So you've got students, you've got clergy, local organizers, you've got Black women's groups, you've got the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, the Congress of Racial Equality that had been created in the 1940s during World War II. You've got the Southern Christian Leadership Conference started by Martin Luther King Jr. These are the people really forcing the pace, and freedom doesn't drift down from above. It really gets demanded from below, from all of those blades of grass. I told you I was ready for this episode, even if I didn't know the topic ahead of time.
You know what? That sounds like an interesting book that I would pick up and begin to read if it was just called Blades of Grass.
Oh, yeah. That is a
Not
good
Leaves
title.
of Grass.
No, Blades of Grass.
Walt
Blades.
Whitman already did that one.
Not
Right.
Blades of Glory,
Or
Blades
that.
of Grass.
Underrated movie, Blades of Glory.
Oh.
Silly, but
Very
funny.
silly.
But funny.
Hugely important, I would say, as far as the filmography of the United States. Anyway, so when I think about the grassroots stuff, one of the things I think about is the Freedom Rides in 1961. And so for the uneducated, that's not our audience, clearly. But interracial activists, they get on buses, they head into the Deep South, and they are testing the limits of federal rulings against segregation and interstate travel. And the response to this is going to be absolutely savage. And again, we brought this up before. It's so critical that this is the age of television as well. So as a lot of these things start to unfold, we're seeing them in living color, on TV. Well, we're probably seeing it black and white, but anyway.
Living Color was the sketch comedy show.
It's true.
In the 90s.
That's right. With the Wayans.
The Wayans brothers.
yeah.
And early Jim Carrey.
Jim Carrey. Oh, brilliant. So Anniston, Alabama, for instance, a bus is firebombed in Birmingham and Montgomery. Riders are beaten. Here's the key, that violence is not an accidental side note. It becomes the story itself. Americans see in real time what segregation requires to sustain itself.
And hit the continuity button.
Continuity.
Right. If we think about, we were talking about this in class a little bit. There are these moments of change where either maybe it's a written text or it's a novel or it's a particular speech, but it shows Americans what's going on and what's happening around them. So we were talking about how Uncle Tom's Cabin was really one of the first times that Northerners are going to see the horrors of slavery. That Common Sense was one of the first times that Americans plainly saw the issues laid out in front of them. This is another example where working class, middle class,
Muckrakers, the progressive era.
Another continuity. We've got this example here of people in their homes watching the nightly news, maybe eating one of those TV dinners with a TV tray, and they see this and they're like, oh my God, this is happening in America. This is crazy. And so this is what is really going to force Kennedy to start to address some of these things, because it's really an embarrassment for the White House, the fact that these events are happening on TV. And it's not because Kennedy himself is all of a sudden like, oh my gosh, there's racism, but the crisis is impossible to really keep in the South any longer. The movement starts to escalate. There's an international audience. And then Birmingham in 1963 becomes an even bigger hinge moment because Martin Luther King Jr., already made famous during the 1950s, is becoming this national figure. And Birmingham turns into something even larger. Becomes the moral center of this movement.
And by the way, this is the goal of Martin Luther King Jr. and his strategy of nonviolent direct action, that you have activists break unjust laws on purpose, and then you create this chaos of violence and exclusion and just horrible things that are then plastered on TV and newspapers, and it gets people to start changing their minds and starting to really speak out and demanding for some change. So Birmingham, like we said, Birmingham, Alabama is going to really put this contrast on TV. You have children marching. There's a very famous children's march that happens there. Kids are going to be fire hosed to make them disperse. Police dogs are going to be turned on these children. Bull Connor, he was the sheriff of Birmingham? Yeah. He, directs all of this. Kids are going to be put into jail cells. There's going to be all kinds of violence. But at the same time, there's really a huge amount of discipline here by the activists who are not fighting back, but who are very persistent in their goals of, creating this chaos, but also not, physically fighting back, showing their own dignity and discipline. So this movement, it's brilliant in its strategy here, and it knows that the nation needs to see this system very clearly.
And it clearly sees it. Like we just said on TV, it's splashed everywhere. And this really forces Kennedy to finally give the civil rights speech he had been resisting. So in June of '63, he tells the nation that the rights of every American are diminished when the rights of one are threatened. And he says plainly that racial discrimination, out loud in front of a TV, his voice saying very clearly, discrimination is a moral issue as old as the scriptures and as clear as the Constitution. And so that matters coming out of the president's mouth. The presidency is no longer speaking as if this is just a regional disturbance or something cultural that needs to take care of itself on its own. It's naming it, labeling it as a national crisis.
And this is also a huge change for the Democratic Party.
Yes, I was going to say,
yeah. I mean,
well, you could say Truman started to edge in that direction by desegregating the military, which was met with huge outcry by Southern Democrats. But then Kennedy actually taking this step, he's basically, he knows he's going to lose the Southern Dixiecrats,
right?
The Southern Democratic wing of the party that has essentially said, if this is a bridge too far, and if you go in this route, we are going to break off, and they do. They're going to create their own kind of independent party. You have Byrd and eventually Wallace that go in this direction. So this is the beginning of a massive change within the Democratic Party, right? And so we need to kind of stop and acknowledge that political change, but then it goes further. The civil rights movement continues and pushes beyond this when there's a March on Washington in 1963. And usually, this is where we talk about the I Have a Dream speech, which of course is monumental. But the full march is more than just King's speech, as eloquent and as passionate as it was, because the march is really about jobs and economic opportunity and freedom. And this matters, right? Increasingly, King and the civil rights movement are going to pair together this idea of economic opportunity and social equality. And so, yes, unbelievable speech, but the gathering is also saying something deeper, that we need legal equality, economic opportunity, and the whole nation is watching.
So this is kind of a combination of Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois, right?
Nice,
they
yeah.
kind of had separate thoughts on this. W.E.B. Du Bois thought it was, legal equality had to happen now, whereas Booker T. Washington really saw the economic piece being more important, and now they're being combined by the modern civil rights movement. So his speech, it's more radical than the inspirational clip that everybody sees, right? I have a dream that one day, he's not offering this vague sort of optimism. He's really saying that America wrote this note to Black citizens, and they have defaulted on that essentially economic note and economic promise. And it's not soft language. That's a really direct indictment of all of American history and the issues of American history.
And I really can't think of any. Nothing stands out, at least not in the 20th century. Great American speeches more prominent than what he said. So then politically, you have Kennedy, who was assassinated in November of '63, and so LBJ, Lyndon Baines Johnson, uses the shock of that moment to push legislation through Congress, and he can do so because as stylistically perfect and popular as JFK's image was, he did not have the political chops that LBJ did in Congress. And so this is one of those brutal ironies of history. Tragedy becomes political momentum.
Right, and that's ultimately that momentum is going to lead to the Civil Rights Act of 1964, a huge piece of legislation. We need to kind of make sure we understand exactly what this does. It outlaws segregation in public accommodations like hotels and restaurants, and it bans discrimination in employment. It also strengthens the federal government's power to enforce desegregation. So in other words, it basically says the Jim Crow system as a legal system is done. It's over.
But this is where we should be careful not to just tell this triumphant story too quickly. The Civil Rights Act, it is enormous. In 1964, it's one of the great legislative achievements in American history, but it does not magically solve the deeper problem. A law can open a lunch counter, but it cannot by itself make a registrar stop terrorizing black voters in Mississippi. It cannot by itself erase segregated housing in Chicago. It cannot by itself undo generations of unequal wealth.
Right, and that's why the movement turns really hard toward voting rights. Because that's kind of the missing piece here. And so because if you can't vote, you can't reliably protect any other right. So Southern states had spent decades building obstacles to black voting, literacy tests, poll taxes, residency traps, intimidation, firing people from jobs, threatening families, beating and outright murdering people who organized against the system. The point was simple: keep black citizens politically powerless.
And that's why voting rights is not really this secondary issue. It becomes the major issue because public accommodations, that matters. Integrating schools, important. Employment, also important. But what protects all of that and sort of institutionalizes that is the ballot box, right? The power of the vote. And the ballot is what ultimately controls who's on your school board, who manages your local courthouse, who controls the sheriff's office, and ultimately who writes laws and who enforces them.
So in 1964, then, the Freedom Summer begins, where hundreds of activists go into Mississippi to register voters and build political power. So it kind of gets confusing. You have the Freedom Riders in 1961, and now you have the Freedom Summer of 1964. And this campaign, it's really a test of courage on a level that's hard to exaggerate. Because churches are going to be burned. These electoral workers are harassed. They're jailed. They're beaten. James Chaney and Andrew Goodman and Michael Schwerner are murdered in all of this. And the Freedom Summer, it's not just an organizing drive. It's really an exposure of what democracy looked like on the ground in Mississippi.
Right. Mississippi, in so many ways, are going to be the epicenter here. And this is where Fannie Lou Hamer becomes such a powerful voice. She's not polished in the way elites wanted her to be. She's not deferential either. She's devastating. Her testimony at the DNC, the Democratic National Convention, forces the country to hear what Mississippi citizenship actually means for a black woman trying to vote. And that is why her line lands so hard. She is not asking a rhetorical question. She's putting America on trial.
And I think a great song that captures all of this is Mississippi Goddamn.
Oh, yeah, Nina Simone.
Yeah,
no question.
And so if you want to really hear an emotional voice discussing all of these things that we're talking about, that is a song from the time period. That's a primary source right there.
It is, yeah. We could pause and play a clip here of the song. Ready?
Let's go.
Well, I didn't have it prepared.
I'm saying, yeah, you could edit it in later.
Oh.
I don't know if that'd be copyright law.
Yeah, let's not get into that.
Okay. All right.
Look it up on YouTube.
Yeah, there you go. All right. So after this, though, comes the real culminating moment in Selma in 1965, Bloody Sunday, as it's called, on the famous Edmund Pettus Bridge. So what happens here, again, we've got peaceful marchers, and they are greeted by state violence. And once more, probably more so than ever before, in anticipation of this confrontation between peaceful marchers and the local state government, there are TV cameras everywhere, and they capture all of this. And the brutality of that moment when peaceful marchers are beaten with billy clubs and run over by horses, it's the visibility of all that really matters. It's a pattern in the movement that we're zeroing in on. Power is really counting on the isolation, but the movement says we won't remain isolated, especially if we can gain national exposure.
And now Johnson is going to move on this. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 is going to become law, and this empowers the federal government to intervene where states have denied the vote on the basis of race. It attacks those barriers like literacy tests, and it gives the federal government real enforcement tools for this. And this is why the act matters so much. It doesn't just announce a principle, but it also creates a machinery that will ensure this will actually be enforced.
Right, and the effects are immediate. New black voters register across the South. Political life begins to shift, not instantly, not perfectly, not without backlash, certainly, but measurably. So by the mid-1960s, the legal architecture of Jim Crow has taken severe body blows from both the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act.
It's really 100 years after Reconstruction, the federal government is finally instituting some of these changes. But here we have a turn, right? Because success creates a new level of expectations. And now that these laws have changed, people ask the next logical question: why does inequality still feel so entrenched?
All right, so here is where the movement changes, because by the mid-1960s, the center of gravity is not just the South anymore. The Great Migration had transformed the North and the West for decades since World War I, and millions of Black Americans had left the South seeking jobs and schools and really a chance to live with more safety and dignity, but they did not leave racism behind.
Right, and so Northern racism is going to look a little different. It's going to be fewer Jim Crow signs. It's going to be more, less obvious, more subtle, more redlining. This is something that we talked about in class in the real estate business.
Can you explain that, Mr. Hill, just for our audience?
Redlining. So the stuff that happened as early as like in the 1930s, really with the New Deal, and how Black individuals had trouble, first of all, procuring home loans and being engaged in some of the New Deal programs. But when neighborhoods are set up, there is a so-called green section and a red section. And the red section was supposed to signify the lesser part of the neighborhood. And oftentimes this is where minorities were forced to live. Mm-hmm. And so that's where the term red line comes from. So fewer segregated drinking fountains, like I said, more segregated neighborhoods, however, fewer formal literacy tests, but more underfunded schools, predatory landlords instead, job discrimination, police violence, and white resistance to integrated housing.
And that brings us to Chicago, because Chicago is a place where you have not only a large number of Black migrants that came up from the Great Migration, but you also have really strong immigrant communities that are really resistant to this new Black labor force. So there's already tension there over housing, schooling. So King comes to Chicago in 1966, and a lot of people don't follow the story past 1965 because that sort of seems like the high water mark. But really, King wants the nation to see that the problem, it's not just Southern segregation, but the fact that inequality exists everywhere. And Chicago becomes this place where there's a campaign to target housing and employment discrimination. And in some ways, this is even harder terrain to navigate because there is no single segregationist figure like a Bull Connor. There's not a clean law or legal target. Instead, the injustice is spread throughout different neighborhoods, banking systems, the city's police, and just customs that had been ingrained into Chicago for decades.
And white hostility in Chicago is super intense, and that matters because it punctures the comforting Northern myth that racism was basically a Southern disease. It also helps explain the urban uprisings of that period. We had uprisings in Harlem and in Watts, California, Newark, New Jersey, Detroit. these are not just random explosions out of nowhere. They come from this tension over poverty, policing, exclusion, and a lot of pent-up rage.
And
Pent-up rage.
Pent up. Yes.
Pent up.
And so there's this long continuity that you, the students, continuity. See, I can't say it as well as
Yeah,
Ms.
you
Keltner.
did. You did a good job.
Okay, thanks. I appreciate it. You should take notice of this. When northern and midwestern cities erupt in racial violence in the 1960s, there's an echo of the Red Summer of 1919. The settings have changed, but the underlying pattern has not disappeared. You got migration, you got competition, segregation, resentment, police bias, and white backlash. The city remains a battleground over who belongs and on what terms.
And here we have the arrival of the Black Power movement. It's often misunderstood by Americans and often in APUSH classes because when you first hear it, you immediately go to this idea of more radical militancy and just flat out anger. But really, at its core, Black Power means a level of self-determination, establishing a sense of Black pride, trying to take more political control and economic power, and at the same time refusing to depend on this idea of white elitists sort of bestowing approval for Black movements.
And that's where it differs from earlier mainstream civil rights organizations like the NAACP, which had relied heavily on legal challenges and courtroom strategies and integrationist goals. It also differs from King's public vision of interracial nonviolence. Black Power is much more skeptical that moral appeal alone will transform the country. It really asks who controls the schools, who controls the police, who controls the businesses, who defines beauty and history and dignity.
Right. And so SNCC, Student Nonviolent Coordinating Council or Committee?
Committee.
Committee. Oh, wow. Okay.
Committee.
That was so, and they kind of like take on that shift. Early SNCC had been deeply committed to interracial nonviolent direct action, but by the middle of the decade, a lot of people are getting frustrated. Organizers are exhausted. They're not seeing the kind of change that they'd hoped to see. Violence continues. White liberals are really disappointing to them. Again, not a whole lot of movement. Then you have people like Stokely Carmichael that will popularize the phrase Black Power, and then SNCC becomes more nationalist and less interested in interracial coalition on the older terms.
Right. And so other groups are going to kind of emerge out of the Black Power movement, famously the Black Panthers in Oakland, California. And you got to be careful here. The Panthers are really controversial because it depends on kind of who you ask and what story you want to tell about the Panthers. Because from one lens, the Panthers look much more extreme and borderline radical with holding weapons and kind of portraying this armed resistance in leather jackets. That's what many people remember when they think Black Panthers. But they also, at the same time, ran a lot of social programs like free breakfast and free health clinics. They tried to create public education projects and community patrols. They came up with a 10-point program that tried to outline their demands for freedom, better employment, housing, education, and especially in Oakland, they wanted to end police brutality and establish more community control.
And that's why the Panthers, they matter historically. They're both a symbol and a strategy. They symbolize Black militancy and self-defense, but they also expose a broader truth that by the late 1960s, many Black activists are no longer willing to define freedom only as access to white institutions. They're actually asking whether those institutions themselves are just in the first place.
Right, and you cannot tell the story without Malcolm X. He begins as the most famous spokesperson of the Nation of Islam, criticizing white America in devastating language. And if you hear him speak, you're kind of like, wow, this guy only really had a formal, about a 6th or 7th grade education. And the eloquence and the thoughtfulness that comes into his voice. And a lot of that language is rejecting King's faith in integration and nonviolence. And his message is much more sharp, more separatist, more impatient, more willing to talk about self-defense. His slogan, the ballot or the bullet, captures that urgency.
And it's a very famous speech. But what's important to also note is just as MLK is going to himself change throughout the 1960s and move toward more of a radical position. I mean, King by the end, King is an outright socialist.
Yeah, I mean his speech the last speech he gave was about economic justice for garbage workers in
unions
Memphis.
and the power of unions between black and white workers and the power of the working class. So King, it's almost like Malcolm and MLK both kind of were on these journeys and they met halfway-ish.
Right.
So it's probably oversimplifies it, but
But
still.
Malcolm X is assassinated in 65 and MLK is in 68. Yeah.
Right. So that's sometimes what historians will say is the tragedy is they were kind of on this road to bridging a compromise between the two, but because of assassinations, they're never ever actually able to get there.
They met once?
I think
right?
they formally met once, but then through like back channels, they were always aware of each other.
Right.
And so if MLK moves a little more to more economic radical positions, Malcolm kind of moves more away from the Nation of Islam, and he kind of broadens his view. While he remains fierce, he becomes more open to cross-racial solidarity, and he wants to try to link the black struggle in the United States to like broader anti-colonial struggles and have this more inclusive language.
Oh, yes. Sorry. And that is where the king...
You got caught up in Dr. Garrison's compelling narrative.
It was compelling. That's where the King versus Malcolm story, it gets too simple because, they do have, and they had real differences, big ones. But by the mid-1960s, there, like Garrison was saying, there are these points of convergence. King is growing much more critical of Northern racism and poverty and war and, unequal economic opportunities, which would classify as poverty. But Malcolm is broadening beyond rigid separatism, that both in different ways are exposing the limits of shallow American liberalism.
Right. And so, as you pointed out, they're both murdered. Malcolm X in 65, MLK in 68. So you had two different visions, two different styles, and two enormous losses. And the anger that follows Dr. King's assassination tears through cities across the country. We covered that upheaval last week, but it belongs here too because it marks the emotional breaking point of the nonviolent civil rights era.
All right, so here's where we tell the larger story, because the civil rights movement doesn't stay contained within the black freedom struggle. It becomes more of a model for others to follow. It shows the power of demonstration, and other Americans watch as civil rights activists as they have these successes, and they start to think, well, maybe we can make similar claims.
And you can see that in youth activism almost immediately. The New Left, proper noun, emerges with students who are frustrated not just by specific policies, but by the hollowness of American public life. This is coming out of the 1950s and all of the conformity that seemed to be overtaking the country. So then you get the SDS, Students for a Democratic Society. They talk about participatory democracy, the idea that ordinary people should have real power in shaping the institutions that govern them.
Right. And then Berkeley, as in California campus, explodes with the free speech movement. Mario Savio delivers one of the defining lines of the era when he says, "There comes a time when the operation of the machine becomes so odious that you have to put your bodies upon the gears and make it stop." That line tells you a lot. Students no longer want to be managed quietly. They want to interrupt.
So you have the New Left and this growing counterculture that are going to overlap. They're not the same thing necessarily, but they emerge out of the same milieu. Okay, so that distinction is what we need to make sure is clear. The New Left is explicitly political. So the SDS has all these teach-ins and growing anti-war organizations, and they make these campus demands for institutional change. But the counterculture is more about lifestyle and rebelling against the conformity, the clothes, hairs, music, drugs, establishing communes, new ways of living, and denying the middle class conformity that they had grown up with.
And music is such a part of that story in a very serious historical way. It's not background noise. It's really a carrier of values. Between folk music and rock music, we have protest songs. Festival culture starts to become widespread, and these really help create a common language of dissent. And Woodstock in 1969 becomes the symbolic high point of all of this. A mass gathering with music and, of course, mud and all the crazy conditions. You got to have the mud at the festival. Idealism, improv, real vision, however imperfect, of another way to live.
So, but we have to be clear about this. Not all young Americans were hippies. Not all college students were radicals. Not all protesters took drugs. Not all music fans joined movements. But the counterculture was visible. It was influential and culturally very loud. It was not universal. That matters because one reason backlash grows is that many Americans feel they are being caricatured or pushed aside by a youth culture they do not recognize as their own.
And I should say, if I was breathing heavily into the mic, Keltner suggested...
I wasn't going to bring it up.
I just want to apologize.
I didn't want to bring it up.
Sometimes I breathe heavily.
I was trying to be thoughtful and just wanted to point it out to you, but I can just... You know, I always point this out to you, and you said that Liz does too, where you're always like...
Is it the passion that you get behind something and it just comes out? Or?
Constant.
I don't know if it's constant. If there are any medical professionals in the audience and you believe this is a sign of concern, please send us a
it is
message.
allergy season.
It is out, yes.
It doesn't
Asthma?
matter the time of year.
Okay, all right then. Okay.
Send us a message on Instagram at @pushforall if you think I need to get this checked out. Okay, so yes, not all Americans were hippies by any means. Not all Americans were part of the counterculture, the drug culture. Instead, we have to kind of widen out here because activism is going to rise sharply across many different groups, and it's really going to appear in groups that have seemed to have been forgotten or left out of the American story. For example, Native Americans. They'd endured generations of broken treaties. They had forced assimilation, terminated policies. They'd been relocated and kind of left in an impoverished, invisible state. But by 1968, we have activists forming AIM, the American Indian Movement, kind of reclaiming that term Indian as a more inclusive, unifying concept. And in 1969, they occupy Alcatraz, former Indian land, by this group, Indians of All Tribes. They're going to take the abandoned prison and turn it into a dramatic stage for Native claims of sovereignty and the right of self-determination.
And Alcatraz is a great teaching moment because it really forces students to see that Native activism, it's not just about inclusion into America, right? It's about the history of all of this. Treaty rights, land rights, who has jurisdiction, how these various tribes are going to survive, and also cultural continuity. And that's really a different kind of rights language. It's not just let us into your institutions in your society, but also honor what was taken from us.
Right. And so in addition to what you guys have already mentioned, you have the Chicano movement that is growing by leaps and bounds in the same time period. Farm workers, students, neighborhood organizers, cultural nationalists, and voting rights activists all push for change. And here we need to widen the frame beyond one icon. Cesar Chavez matters, yes. Dolores Huerta matters.
Ooh, nice.
But so do Larry Itliong and the Filipino organizers who helped launch the Delano. Delano? I always said Delano. Delano. I think Delano?
I'd say Delano.
Delano. Sorry if that is incorrect. Grape Strike. The movement is coalition, labor, sacrifice, boycott, and again, getting back to the grassroots thing that you guys made a point of earlier, organization. If you don't have the nameless, faceless people as the blades of grass who are organizing this on the ground level, none of this stuff works.
And it's a lesson in putting too much of the narrative behind one individual because recently, if you've been paying attention in the news, Chavez's legacy has been re-examined. That's probably a polite way to put it. After some disturbing allegations reports about his behavior and treatment of women. Now, if you focus too much on that, you miss the important farm work struggle that was going on, as we said, at the grassroots level. And we have to focus more on the larger movement and other individuals who were part of it because that's what good history is. Movements are bigger than icons.
Yeah. And then, so we've talked about Native Americans, we've talked about the student movements, the Chicano movements, and then there is the gay liberation movement that forms towards the end of the 1960s. Before the very famous Stonewall riots, many gay Americans lived under constant threat of the potential police raids at local hangouts, job loss, social stigma, criminalization. And when police raided the Stonewall Inn in New York City in June of 1969, the response was very different. People resisted, and that resistance became really a turning point. That Stonewall, it didn't create LGBTQ plus activism from nothing, but it really became the symbol that gave the movement momentum and visibility.
Right. And that too fits our larger theme, which is the 60s and the 70s are not only about one movement winning, they are about so many groups learning to say, we are so done being invisible.
Which is a great natural segue to talk about women, right? It's not a side story, but it's really one of the longer stories we've told throughout American history about women gradually gaining more and more of a foothold in American political and cultural life. They start to, in this time period, gain a central role. You could kind of point to Betty Friedan's The Feminine Mystique as being one of these texts that, again, helps call out a problem. That she says, the problem that has no name. What she means by that is the dissatisfaction of many middle-class women who had been told that domestic fulfillment alone should be enough for them.
And what's powerful there is that Friedan is naming a contradiction similar to the other ones that other movements had named, right? That America is saying abundance and comfort and suburbs and modern convenience. But many women and all these other groups that we talked about, they're saying, why does this still feel like confinement? Why is this still limited to a certain number of people? Why are intelligence and ambition and education being narrowed into one approved script that's being accepted by society?
Right. And that leads to NOW, the National Organization for Women in 1966. Its goal is not symbolic inclusion. It wants enforcement, law, access, equal opportunity, equal pay, full participation. And this is where students should notice continuity. Again, the women's movement borrows from civil rights in strategy, language, and legal thinking, even as it develops its own priorities.
And even another continuity there is think about how middle-class women especially, who are involved in the early abolitionist movement will use that as a jumping pad to start advocating for their own rights.
Right. And so this is second wave feminism that we're talking about in the 1960s. I think that's maybe helpful for us. First wave feminism was all about suffrage, which is achieved by the 19th Amendment in 1920. Yeah.
Yeah, that's right.
Just checking. And
nailed it. Never in doubt.
So second wave feminism really begins with the publication of The Feminine Mystique. And obviously suffrage has been achieved, but equality really in society and in the economy and in politics has not been.
Exactly. It's the workplace equality. It's reproductive freedom, access to higher education, the professional world in general, having access to childcare, and much more. So the Equal Rights Amendment sort of encapsulates all this. And for a time, it looks like this actual amendment could finally make its way to the Constitution, and it does pass Congress in 1972, but then it stalls. And
first introduced in the 1920s by Alice Paul.
Right.
That's
so
correct.
this has this thing that has a lot of momentum behind it, but it's not until this moment that it pushes through. And it stalls, though, because it's one of the key reminders of the era. Reform movements are very capable of winning important gains, but they don't get everything that they ask for.
But two achievements really need to be named clearly, I think, for our audience. First is Title IX in 1972 prohibits sex discrimination in federally funded education programs. And that ends up really mattering in academics, admissions, and really athletics. You hear Title IX still talked about with athletics and campus life in ways that ripple for decades and today, too.
Right. And then the second is Roe v. Wade in 1973, which nationalizes abortion rights under a constitutional right to privacy. For years, that looked like a settled legal landmark, but you fast forward to 2022, Dobbs v. Jackson Women's Health Organization. that we actually the Supreme Court overrules Roe, removing that constitutional protection and returning abortion regulation to the individual states.
Which is this important modern connection that we should hear these changes, we should hear these new interpretations and understand that this is something big, that a movement victory can feel permanent in one generation, but can become contested in another. Rights can be won, they can be maintained, reinterpreted, defended, revised, but then sometimes those rights are rolled back.
And I think you can see this larger pattern. You know, we're kind of wrapping up Stonewall, for example. It's not just history in a chapter heading. It's still a site of struggle over public memory and identity. And even in 2026, the symbolism of Stonewall is still actively contested in public life. If you research it, you'll see what I'm talking about. And this really tells us that these movements are not dead history. They are living arguments.
Exactly. So maybe the biggest takeaway from this whole episode is that the 60s and the 70s were not one single unified revolution. They were overlapping movements, sometimes allied, sometimes divided, sometimes borrowing from one another, sometimes frustrating one another. Civil rights inspired all of them, but none of them unfolded in exactly the same way.
Right. And so we have to importantly note that not all Americans embraced all or maybe any of these, because not all of white America opposed these things, right? Not all young Americans joined the counterculture. Not all women agreed with feminist aims. Not all black activists agreed with black power or with the strategies of MLK. Not all Latinos rallied around Chavez, and not all gay Americans joined these same tactics. There's a lot of complexity here.
Yeah, and if we flatten this into everybody in the 60s got radical, we really miss the other half of the story, that many Americans felt disoriented, they felt left behind, they felt talked down to, or they felt exhausted by the speed of all of this social change. And some really hated these movements, and some supported parts but rejected others. Some wanted reform but not necessarily societal upheaval.
Right. I think exhaustion is the best word to use here. And so that's where the politics of the next era following starts to come into focus. The quote-unquote silent majority doesn't appear in a vacuum. It grows in the space created by all this conflict between visible protests and anxious reaction, between liberation and the backlash to it, between expanding rights and the fear of disorder. We talked about that political turn last week. And this episode, I think, helps explain why that door was open.
So in the end, this is the story of a nation arguing over who counts, who belongs, who decides what freedom is, and who has access to it. And that's why these movements matter so much. They did not just change laws. They changed the questions Americans asked.
And the modern connection is everywhere. Voting access, policing, campus speech, public monuments, Title IX. You guys, this is like, I mean, it's a lineup of the 60s and 70s, but it's like, these are headlines that we see every day in the newspaper, right? So reproductive rights, LGBTQ visibility, labor organizing, representation in textbooks. We are still living in arguments that took their modern shape in these years.
Which makes this a pretty important episode.
Yeah, and a long one.
Yes, it is.
A lot to cover.
We covered a lot, and thank you for listening to it here at A Push for All. If you liked the episode, make sure you subscribe on Spotify, Apple iTunes, YouTube. Leave us a review. Send a message if you're concerned about my heavy breathing. If you've got
sending a message.
any other topics you want us to cover, send it over at apushforall at Instagram.
Until next time, keep learning from yesterday to make sense of today.